Welcome to Helion Talks. I'm joined today by writer, former journalist, and U.S. Congress senior staffer Gabe Neville, author of The Last Men Standing, the 8th Virginia Regiment in the American Revolution. Gabe, it's great to have you. Let's start with a bit about you, please.
So I'm a lifelong enthusiast in particularly U.S. Revolutionary War history. I was a little boy during the bicentennial of the American Revolution, and I got the bug then. I specifically remember my sister had a subscription to National Geographic, which is probably known to international listeners. And in the July 1976 issue, they had a spread of photographs of Revolutionary War veterans, obviously all very old men. But I was just mesmerized by that. I sat there for hours looking into those faces, wondering what they had experienced. We lived very close to Valley Forge Park. There was a little Revolutionary War cemetery near our house. So I kind of grew up with things to look at that captured my attention, and I've never lost the bug.
Gabe, if I could ask, I think you've started hinting at what drew you to this topic. But also in your foreword, you mentioned that many people consider this book impossible to write, but you've done it.
That is evidence of mania and insanity more than anything else. I've probably spent 20 years researching it. Like anyone who's interested in a historical topic, particularly something that is under-researched, you get your foot in the door and you see a little bit of something and you know that there's more, and it can very easily turn into an obsession. And that kind of happened to me. I say it took 20 years to research, but 20 years ago, it was just a passing interest. Well, not passing, what I thought might have been a passing interest. And the story I tell is that I once went to the David Library of the American Revolution, which is now closed, but it was the place to go back then in the 90s if you wanted to research something related to the American Revolution. And they were pretty close to closing time. It was, I guess, 3 p.m. or so when I got there. They closed at 5. Told the librarian what I wanted, and he told me where to go and where to dig. And when I left, I told him there didn't seem to be much out there. And he gave me this very stern look and said, "There's a ton out there. You just have to go find it." That stuck in my mind. Soon after that, I got a job down in Washington, D.C., literally diagonally across the street from America's best research library, the Library of Congress. And then I was off to the races. So, I spent a lot of time researching it. The notion that it was impossible to write really was true for a long time. If you go back in time, 40, 50 years, or even more recently, it was just too hard to access the resources. I've traveled all over the country, or the eastern half of the country, obviously done a lot on the internet. There are a couple of gentlemen who have transcribed all of the southern state pension applications, including the attestations to service, and they are searchable, and that was a huge aid. I found some diaries and other documents that previous scholars just didn't know existed. The one thing that really made a difference was the ability to, well, frankly, Microsoft Excel. I broke all of the data into discrete data points and tied to date and geography so that I could sort them and figure out which company was where and what they were doing. And if someone's recollection was a little bit out of sequence, I could correct it. So, it took a lot of work, but I got it done.
It's amazing. There's nothing like that kind of sobering comment from a seasoned archivist to librarian, right? That because, there's just such a difference between most of the world and people kind of steeped in this old documentation for the perspective, if you know what I mean. They're like, yeah, loads is out there.
Yeah, that's totally true. I could see in his face that he wasn't even sure if he wanted to say anything because he didn't know how serious I was. But I think he was almost doing me a favor by challenging me.
Absolutely, and look how far it's gotten, and that's just an amazing piece of research. Going into that level. And for our listeners, would you be able to perhaps frame the context of the American Revolution a little bit? Just what was at stake, and how did people in places like Western Virginia see the war?
Yeah. So that's a great question. And I think I get answered by contrasting the way people in inland United States or the frontier viewed it and how that was different from the narrative that we're usually told about. If you listen to Thomas Jefferson or John Hancock or, Sam Adams, the famous founders, They were talking about representation of parliament. They were talking about taxation without representation, the rights of British citizens, those sorts of things. And of course, all of that mattered to everyone in America. But in the West, particularly the west of Pennsylvania and the west of Virginia, the settlers were very largely immigrants from Northern Ireland and what was known as the Palatinate. This is the Rhineland of southwestern Germany. They were religiously different from earlier settlers, particularly in Virginia, which was very English, very Anglican. So they were religiously different, linguistically different, culturally different, and they lived literally on the other side of the mountains. And they were, like everyone else, looking for opportunity. And America was a continent at that time that had no stock markets, it had no banks, it didn't even really have any precious metal currency because all of that got shipped back to the old world. So the only form of wealth was land. That was the only thing that you could acquire that represented durable wealth and sustainable prosperity. And everybody wanted it. And it was available cheaply on the other side of the mountains. And of course, it gets very complicated in terms of who can get what land and where and how much of it. You had laws that prohibited, and a royal edict that prohibited people from settling on the other side of the Appalachian Mountains following the French and Indian War. That was extended, or the boundary was extended to the Ohio River in 1768. But you also had to have a treaty with an Indian tribe to settle, really to arrive at quiet title. And it was against the law to build a cabin somewhere that was not ceded to Virginia or Pennsylvania by an Indian tribe. So this, of course, led to lots of conflict. That is what these Western folks wanted. They wanted land. They wanted the ability to go west, and the Crown had been resisting it. The French and Indian War was expensive, and the Crown didn't want to do that again. And that was the primary source of conflict in the West.
And with that broader context and focusing on the subject of your research, who were the 8th Virginia Regiment and a little bit about why they were formed and what made them perhaps different from other units?
So the regiment was authorized in December of 1775, and it was intended to be what the Revolutionary Virginia Convention called a German regiment. They did not intend by that for it to be an exclusively German regiment in terms of personnel. They intended it to be led by Germans and to be a place where Germans could participate in the revolution. There was concern that they might not be interested in joining the cause. My estimation is that about 40% of the regiment was probably Germans. First generation, second generation, a couple of third generation Germans. Another 40% were probably what in America we call Scotch Irish. These would be Ulstermen from Northern Ireland, Protestant Irish. And the balance, concentrated particularly amongst the officers, were English, one Dutch captain, and smatterings of other things. So that was the population. The field officers were 3 Germans, most famously Peter Muhlenberg. The major was an immigrant, but the lieutenant colonel and the colonel were second, third generation Germans. And they recruited and took the field in the spring of 76.
Very interesting. Especially the mix, having that German influence. You spoke about the senior officers and a lot about the American Revolution, focus perhaps on the high-ups, but you rather focus on everyday people. And could you give us a high-level overview, maybe perhaps just a couple of lines, how the story unfolds in your book, where it begins and where you take the reader?
Yeah. So I go back to the very beginning. I start with these guys when they're kids during the French and Indian War, literally getting chased by Indians. The French and Indian War was utterly brutal, and these kids grew up traumatized, many of them. And they had hard feelings towards the French and the Indians that lasted for a long, long time in most cases. There was a late colonial Indian war with the Shawnee tribe that many of them participated in. It is referred to as Lord Dunmore's War. Lord Dunmore was the last colonial governor of Virginia, and he actually personally led troops during that conflict. So many of them came into the service as experienced combatants, which was not true for most of the rest of Virginia. Even militia service in most of Virginia was a social exercise. But these guys were experienced hunters, experienced warriors, at least many of them were. They were riflemen, which was an important distinction from other Virginia soldiers who almost exclusively carried muskets. We can talk about that in more detail if you'd like. They were recruited into 10 companies. Each company was raised by a particular county. The officers were appointed by the Revolutionary committees. We sometimes call them committees of safety now, but that's actually not what they were called. They were just called county committees. The Committee of Safety was the statewide revolutionary leadership executive body. And to earn your commission, you had to recruit a certain number of soldiers. When they had done that, they marched to Suffolk, which is a little town in the tidewater of southeastern Virginia near the larger city of Norfolk. They helped to expel Dunmore from Virginia, and then they marched south to Charleston, South Carolina, to combat a much larger British force. Interestingly, they had been recruited not as continental soldiers, but as provincial soldiers. Until the Declaration of Independence, there were no state soldiers because there were no states yet. They were still provinces or colonies. And by definition, a provincial soldier was tasked with defending his colony or his province or later his state. It was specifically not their job to go defend another state or another colony. But they were taken out of the colony anyway, and this became a major source of discontent, leading to some desertions. Once they got to the South, the majority of them contracted malaria, and a very large proportion of them died or were incapacitated. In the spring of 1777, they returned, in December of 76 and then into the spring of 77, they attempted to recruit back to full strength. They were unable to do that. Virginia had been heavily recruiting, and it was harder to find men. The rage militaire was over. People were starting to see men with missing arms and legs. People now had brothers who had died from malaria or from smallpox, and recruiting became much more difficult. From there, they went into the Philadelphia campaign, the much more famous battles of Brandywine and Germantown. I don't think you asked me to take you all the way through their career, so I'll stop there. But that was the first part of their service.
That's fascinating, especially this part about the provincial element. And I'm wondering, as they've gone through the campaigns and entering the war and taking a more prominent role, you mentioned some of these battles. Is there a few elements that you could touch on for us, Gabe, just to give us a flavor of how they did, in terms of combat experience and then eventually joining up with the main army?
Yeah, sure. So at the very beginning of the war in Virginia, you actually had multiple kinds of soldiers. You had militia who technically reported to the governor. So that was sort of an awkward topic as long as there was a royal governor still. You had volunteer bodies that were just that. They were almost extra legal, just like the county committees were. There was an experiment with Minutemen, who were sort of super permanently activated militia. And then you had provincial and then continental troops. So early on, the 8th Virginia was part of a motley army that included pretty much all of those kinds of soldiers. And when they got down to South Carolina, there were full-time regulars down there who had been offered continental commissions, but had refused to accept them. And you had a command dispute between John Armstrong, who was the brigadier general who'd been sent down to take command, and then later Charles Lee, the major general who was commander of the Southern Department and led the 8th Virginia down there, and the South Carolina forces who refused to submit to their authority. They had all sorts of reasons for that, including the rules of engagement, what they called the Articles of War, how many lashes could be applied to a truculent soldier's back, that all sorts of disputes. But they finally relented and said, okay, for now, we will submit to your authority in this battle. The most famous part of that battle is this half-finished fort that was built on the southern end of Sullivan's Island. It was made out of what we call palmetto logs. So it's sort of a spongy, soft palm tree kind of lumber. Double walls filled with sand. General Lee thought that it was a death trap. He called it that. But the South Carolinians refused to vacate it. And then on the opposite end of that island, the northern end, there were a couple of very small, like a berm, basically, that had some South Carolina regulars posted. They were posted there. Simplifying things slightly, the 8th Virginia was sent to the north end of the island to fend off, I guess we would call it an amphibious landing of troops under General Clinton and General Cornwallis, while that Palmetto Wood Fort was withstanding a naval bombardment, or cannonade, I guess technically, from the warships in the harbor. The fort withstood the cannonade because of the nature of the wood, almost like it was almost like marbles being thrown at a pillow. The wood was soft enough that it didn't crack. And then in the north, and the British tried to claim that they couldn't cross because the water was deeper than they had been told. One report says that those rifles were so accurate and so quick firing that they couldn't get their transports over. So the 8th Virginia played a larger role in that battle than is usually credited. They were not in the lead. They were supporting the South Carolinians there and arrived somewhat later in the action. But that's what they did there. After the battle, and as they returned to Virginia, Peter Muhlenberg wrote a letter to General Washington saying that those rifles were too difficult to maintain for troops that were sleeping in the open, and he asked if they could be swapped for muskets, which is kind of an interesting thing, right? At least here in the U.S., we celebrate Daniel Morgan's rifles a lot, and we think of the riflemen as the heroes of the Revolution. And yet, here's Peter Muhlenberg wanting to ditch his rifles. I'm going too long, but that's a super interesting outcome from that first year service.
It's interesting how the kind of legends and stories from wars and some of the tidbits that sometimes supports and sometimes contradicts, the common understanding. And on that really was where I was going with our final question was, what surprised you the most? Was there something in your research or writing that really caught you off guard?
Yeah, so, I think the answer I have to give you for that is just how brutal the war was. We tend to think of the Revolutionary War, and by we, and maybe I just mean Americans, but we tend to think of the Revolution as a gentleman's war, where prisoners were released on parole, on their word of honor not to engage in combat until properly exchanged, right? And battles had relatively low casualty counts. So I think we tend to think of the war as a gentleman's affair, but it was in fact incredibly brutal. Indian combat was incredibly brutal. And I won't paint excessively ugly pictures here, but what they went through was incredibly severe, and they were traumatized by it.
And what's interesting is when you see some of the documentation that comes out afterwards, just these very high-minded ideas. And when you contrast that to the level of brutality, just that as war becomes more industrialized, and as you correctly mentioned, Gabe, it's an interesting comparison.
Yeah, it sure is. Another thing that really left an impression on me is how much walking they did. They enlisted guys did not have horses, and they walked everywhere. And these guys, some of them marched from Pittsburgh down to Charleston, South Carolina, up to Philadelphia. Several of them marched 1,000 miles before they were engaged in real combat.
Yeah, that's just next level fitness. I mean, honestly, it's amazing. And it's really wonderful to hear, just so much detail tonight about the 8th Virginia Regiment. And I think our listeners are going to be fascinated by this. And we will include in our show notes, of course, the links to your book, Gabe. And from our end, just a really big thank you for this excellent walkthrough of your book, The Last Man Standing, the 8th Virginia Regiment in the American Revolution. And we'll feeding back any comments and questions from our listeners.
Thanks so much for having me.